Welcome to Hudson Institute for our conversation on enhancing cybersecurity, industrial security, and information security as the foundation for Japan's defense transformation. I'm Ken Weinstein, the Walter P. Stern Distinguished Fellow at Hudson Institute, and we're interested in discussing Japan's defense transformation. This has been a remarkable time period in Japan in the face of significant political headwinds at home. Prime Minister Kishida is deftly charting a bold course, refashioning Japan's strategic culture and doubling Japan's defense spending. On December 16th, his government released 3 transformative strategic documents: the National Security Strategy, the National Defense Strategy, and the Defense Buildup Plan that collectively mark a turning point in Japanese history. For the first time since the end of World War II, Japan has deemed its military capabilities essential for protecting the nation, keeping the peace, and promoting international order. And the Prime Minister has just ended a whirlwind diplomatic tour, which saw him announce a new strategic partnership with Italy and a historic defense agreement with the United Kingdom, the second reciprocal access agreement signed in the last few months, coming on the heels of one recently signed with Australia. The White House, of course, was the most consequential trip on this tour for the Prime Minister. Now, the sale of Tomahawk cruise missiles and the agreement to defend Japanese space assets under Article 5 of the U.S.-Japan Mutual Defense Treaty are driving the headlines, but the more important story is far more basic: how the Biden and Kishida governments are cooperating very closely in areas from Ukraine to Taiwan to now outer space. To further cooperation, however, and to achieve the broad defense transformation outlined in the new strategic documents, Japan needs to reform the foundation of how it treats the kinds of information that are critical to security in this era, in which all elements of national power are essential to the cross-domain competition with the People's Republic of China. And so we have today with us 3 noted experts to look at how Japan might enhance its cybersecurity, its information security, and its industrial security as the foundation for defense and security transformation. To my immediate left is Mihoko Matsubara, who is Chief Cyber Strategist for NTT. Next to her is Lindy Kyzer, who is Director of Content for clearancejobs.com. And next to Lindy is Dr. Arthur Herman, Senior Fellow, my colleague here at Hudson Institute. Now we'll start with Mihoko. We're lucky to have you here on one of your DC trips, analyzing the cybersecurity challenges Japan faces. Now Mihoko heads cybersecurity strategy for NTT, Nippon Telegraph and Telephone, which is the 4th largest telecom company in the world, and a company that is absolutely critical to assuring data flows in and out of Japan. And so we're delighted to have you here, Mihoko. We look forward to you sharing your insights. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So I really appreciate your hosting this really important event, and when just the 2+2 was held here in Washington, D.C., and also Prime Minister Kishida is visiting to meet with President Biden to talk about security issues and also opportunities. So I think that there are 3 particular incidents that shaped Japanese mindset toward increasing the cyber defensive capabilities, and also to shape what's written in the 3 strategic documents you just described. So the first incident was the ransomware attack on the U.S. Colonial Pipeline in May 2021, because it demonstrated that even a one cybercrime incident against one company can lead into economic security or national security crisis through the supply chain attack. And the second incident is the ongoing war in Ukraine, because it showcased that a combination of kinetic and cyber attacks can be happening against civilian critical infrastructure companies, and that showcased the need, the collaboration between the government, military, and critical infrastructure companies, both in the peacetime and also wartime. And finally, last but not least, is how China reacted to the Speaker Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan last August, because Taiwan faced a combination of electromagnetic cyber attacks and also disinformation campaigns, in addition to massive military drill surrounding Taiwan. So it showed the urgent need to develop multi-domain operational capabilities in Japan to respond to such a new type of threats. So that is why I think that the national security strategies declare that Ministry of Defense and also self-defense forces will strengthen collaboration with international partners, including the United States, but also civilian agencies and critical infrastructure companies. And not only that, that they will also help critical infrastructure companies with the protection of cybersecurity from cyber attacks. And my background is Japanese Ministry of Defense, and I thought it's revolutionary for the Japanese Ministry of Defense and self-defense forces to say that up front. And definitely the Japanese is learning from the lessons from the ongoing war in Ukraine. And I think this is the right step moving forward to go to, given what's happening in Ukraine and also in the Taiwan Strait. Because it is really difficult for us to predict what kind of cybercrime will evolve into economic security or national security crisis beforehand, just like what we've seen from the ransomware attack on the Colonial Pipeline 2 years ago. So it is really crucial for not only the Japanese Ministry of Defense and self-defense forces, but also to bring in critical infrastructure companies to share cyber threat intelligence and also to do joint exercises on a regular basis to ensure that we have right capabilities to respond to crises in a multi-domains, not only just cyber domains. And I'm so glad and proud to see that the NTT just joined the Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative, or JCDC, this January 2023. It was established by the US Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency under the US Department of Homeland Security to unify cyber defenders, but also to share cyber threat intelligence, because it is not only about one specific company. It demonstrates how much commitment the Japanese industry is willing to make through this type of collective wisdoms to strengthen not only Japanese cybersecurity, but also the international resiliency through this framework. So, but we need to do more. And this new type of development would require information assurance, which is your expertise, and also because we need to share really sensitive intelligence between the government and industry, not within Japan, but also between the two countries. So without having, so that's why I personally believe that it's inevitable for Japan to expand the current security clearance system to cover the Japanese industry, not only the traditional defense industry, but also the wider variety of critical infrastructure companies looking at what's happening in Ukraine. So I thought that it's really encouraging to see how the Japanese and American foreign and defense ministers are welcomed and encouraged and acknowledge the need of information assurance. And I hope that this will accelerate the Japanese side's efforts to do the right directions for the expansion of a security clearance system. And it is really also encouraging for the Japanese because self-defense forces and also the US forces have already conducted joint exercises in multi-domains through the Kingsword and Yamasakura last November to December to test multi-domain operational capabilities, including cyber and space. But again, I think we need to do more because I haven't seen any news articles that they actually invited any of the critical infrastructure companies. And if any crisis happens, then adversary can attack private critical infrastructure companies. And actually, Taiwan is doing more on that front. So they are doing annual military exercise called Hanquan every spring. And at least, as far as I can tell from open sources, they invite critical infrastructure companies to that military drill since 2021. Because again, this can be a potential scenario in wartime. And I hope that Prime Minister Kishida and President Biden will address the needs to what they need to do for the better security collaborations this summit, and also the Prime Minister Kishida's address at SAIS in January to cement and also accelerate the Japanese and American efforts to strengthen cybersecurity, but also multi-domain capabilities. So thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Miho. Fascinating remarks. And I should note that in the U.S. too, we're struggling with also with how to incorporate these infrastructure companies into our cybersecurity. That there are questions of liability, there are questions of information sharing, of reputation protecting that are quite thorny. And the White House is setting up the cybersecurity office that's dealing with the exact same questions that the Japanese government's going to be dealing with. But thank you for that excellent and comprehensive analysis. Delighted now to welcome Lindy Kyzer to speak. Lindy is the Director of Content at clearancejobs.com. She's a former Army Public Affairs Officer, and she has helped transform clearancejobs.com not simply into the largest community of professionals with security clearances in the United States, over 1 million, which is unbelievable, but it's also, and more importantly, the largest trade publication that covers personnel security policy and the clearance vetting processes. If you know her from her articles, her podcasts, or her many speeches, she knows more about the security clearance system in the United States than just about anyone. She is not a Japan expert, but she is going to offer her reflections on what Japan ought to think about as it steps up its security clearance system that it's going to be putting into place. And we welcome you. You've joined us. You flew in from Nebraska, not quite Japan, but we're really delighted.
Yeah, I mean, I don't get any credit for that.
You do.
But thank you for having me. It's a rare passion point to have a passion about the security clearance process, but that's why I'm really glad to convey and talk about it. And seeing other countries care about this matters because, as we know, risks are global and they're not just focused on the U.S. So the more that we can collaborate both on our security and vetting process, the better off we are. So the U.S. government personnel security program is both incredibly complex and straightforward, but also has some confusion. And you can ask President Joe Biden or Donald Trump or former Senator Hillary Clinton. There's plenty of room to go around for how the classification process can be really confusing. So as someone who manages a news organization around this, I don't always hate it when the security clearance process is in the news because it says, even for good or bad, that people are listening. And I'm actually not surprised when I hear about some of these breaches that happen when you think about the size of the U.S. security clearance program. More than 4 million people in the United States have some form of a security clearance. Tens of millions of classified documents are produced each year. That's a separate conversation. You can invite me to have any time about overclassification in the U.S. government system and open source intelligence. But there's basically two aspects to establishing trust within the U.S., and that is industrial security and personnel security. So we want to secure places and we want to secure people. And both are incredibly important. But as we say, our people are our biggest asset, and that also means that they're our biggest risk. And so when you look at the major situations that have happened, the major breaches, it has come down to a people issue. A security clearance is actually just a cool government nickname for eligibility to access classified information, which is the moniker that's born out of executive order. We have facility security clearances to keep our places safe, and we have individual security clearances to issue eligibility to people. These are clearances issued based on 13 adjudicative guidelines. You can brief me on them later. I'll talk about any of them, along with the idea of a whole person concept, which I also like to call the not perfect person concept. The idea within the US is you don't have to be perfect to have eligibility to access classified information. You just have to be able to obtain the trust of the government. And that a single incident or issue in your past should not prevent you from obtaining a security clearance. And that allows us to allow diverse backgrounds, people, experiences into our personnel security program. But the human aspect cannot be overstated. So nearly every significant breach or incident, from the OPM hack to Edward Snowden, Chelsea Manning, Aaron Alexis, those boil down to broken trust, whether malicious or accidental, from individuals safeguarding our secrets and our safety. It's a people process, and so in making the decisions, it's all about the people doing the work. It was in response to Snowden and the Aaron Alexis shooting, the Navy Yard shooting, that the government's Trusted Workforce 2.0 effort was born in 2018. It's a collaboration across the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, the Office of Personnel Management. Trusted Workforce 2.0 has brought an overhaul of the U.S. government's personnel security program, which has been in place since 1947, 1953 timeframe. The approach to reforming the personnel security program has been iterative rather than incremental, so they're literally rebuilding the plane as they fly it, and so far the wings haven't fallen off, so that's good news. Trusted Workforce 2.0 includes reducing the number of investigative tiers, so actually simplifying some parts of the process that were more complex than they needed to be, and also establishing a process for continuous vetting, which is probably the key thing that the US government will talk about when it comes to the importance of vetting today, is the notion of continuously vetting personnel versus a one-time investigation being sufficient. So continuous vetting involves automated records checks, things like criminal background checks, terrorist records, foreign travel, credit. It takes that notion of trust, but then verify into action. So when it comes to personnel security, I do think there are several things that Japan can learn from the US government and US personnel security program. First, that it's good to be trusted. So we frequently talk at clearancejobs.com that a security clearance is like a golden ticket. It can be a path to better job security, broader career options, higher pay. The higher the level of your security clearance, the more money that you obtain. That's borne out in our surveys every year of our community. Mission and money matter to the US worker. So demonstrating how a security clearance or vetting process makes you a more valuable employee could be a key part of the value proposition in Japan. You don't go through a security clearance process because the government doesn't trust you. You go through the process because you want to be a part of this club of cleared personnel. Second, you have to secure places and people. Many folks in the US ask if they can obtain a security clearance on your own. You cannot. The security clearance process is tied to the facility security clearance. So that might be a good model for Japan. It's like you mentioned, there are certain facilities within the critical infrastructure element that are more at risk. So if you know that those are places where breaches have happened or could happen, where our adversaries are attacking those, find a way to vet and clear those facilities and clear those personnel and let the program flow out from there. And third, it's not enough to vet, but you have to engage. To tie it back to the examples I started with, you can't just create a security clearance program or put a stamp on something. Classified documents can still end up in hotels, desk drawers, or on servers where they're not supposed to be. You have to engage and educate your audience. So a proof point is a global report on insider risk found 62% were caused by non-malicious actors. So a lot of the breaches you find within companies are not people that intend to do this. So the personnel security program is about vetting people, but also educating them. The education and cultural component cannot be overstated. There need to be policies and procedures around handling protected information. Education is key to knowing, for personnel knowing that continuous vetting is about employment vetting and not employee monitoring. At its inception of the government's continuous evaluation program, we sometimes kind of misspoke and said continuous monitoring, and people were like, oh, they're monitoring, the government's monitoring us. The policy framework is about vetting, and that's actually a much better and truer statement. They're not checking your browser history, as I frequently have to tell people. They are just vetting using publicly available information that can already be found. So the US government is currently in the midst of its biggest overhaul in its vetting process in 70 years. This is really a catalyst moment in US personnel vetting today, but many of the basics remain the same. Protecting government secrets involves places and people. A good framework can stand the test of time. Community and culture are the secret sauce holding any personnel vetting program together. And because that's the case, I have a lot of confidence that Japan can build a system to increase its position as a defense industry partner for the US. Japan doesn't have to reinvent the wheel here. They just need to kick off a few spokes, add their own streamers, and fly.
Thank you very much, Lindy. Both your expertise and your passion for the security clearance process came through. I've got three quick questions for you on this one. One is a comment. I think, particularly in the Japan case, it says something I think is extraordinarily interesting, which is the focus on mission and money. There's a value proposition to having a clearance, and in Japan is a society which values credentials, which values hierarchy, where people value being respected for their work. And so the notion, one way to sell the security clearance system in Japan is to let people know that you will have this additional credential a sign of expertise. So it's quite a useful. It's I think a very important point in Japan, since people do care about these kinds of gradations as they do in the United States. But given Japanese history, they matter more. The second question I had is, you said 62% of the papers that show up are non-malicious, but are you saying 38% are malicious?
I mean, if you believe the data, I don't know.
Okay.
And that's broader insider threat, and that's important to know. So insider threat, insider risk applies to both classified and non-classified. So that's just across insider threats within companies. So that wouldn't just be breaches of classified information. But I feel like that whole, because you look at the examples that we have, there are folks that are trying to use their position to, to sell, steal, get it to our foreign adversaries.
And do you have any sense of how many there are per year of those cases?
No, but that would be like, I don't know, does the government release that figure? I don't know. Do we know
Probably
that?
not, but no.
I mean, it would be super interesting. I'm like, can I find it? Now you've given me a challenge.
Or a sense of how many clearances are revoked a year?
So very few. I mean, that is the issue there. The
Yeah.
number of security clearance denials and revocations is around 2%.
2%,
So most
wow.
people do not lose their clearance eligibility, which would lead you to think that the number of breaches every year is low.
Yeah.
The Department of Defense that's the Department of Defense. They release their figures every year. The IC does not. The IC puts FOU, puts classification markers on a lot of stuff and doesn't tell us what's going on. So.
And one thing we've talked about before is the fact that in the United States we have different clearances for different departments. And I think one of the recommendations you had before is I think you'd suggested Japan have a universal clearance process that goes across all departments and agencies. Do you want to say a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, in the U.S., even now they're simplifying that through their tiers system, and they're updating the personnel vetting questionnaire that's used for the security clearance process right now. That probably won't go into effect until 2024, 2025. The idea being right now we have 3 different forms that can be used in the process. We have 3 different levels of security clearance within DoD IC. Department of Energy has their own clearance because nuclear secrets are special, so they get their own special category. I think, if you're building a program from scratch, you have the opportunity to say, like, we probably don't need to add, levels of complexity where it's not needed. I think they're even seeing that now. Just they had created more tiers and then reduced them. And even because also when it comes to breaches, I have gotten a stat from the IC that most breaches are folks that have like secret level clearances. So there's not this notion that the higher level your security clearance, the more at risk you are. So I think there's a lot to be said for simplifying the process, knowing that people can risk information at any level that they're granted.
Sure. You just want to go through for the audience just the levels. There's secret, there's top secret, there's sensitive for them. Yeah.
There's confidential, there's secret, and there's top secret. Those are the 3 only levels of security clearance. Folks will talk about the higher levels or the secret squirrel levels. There are special access programs, or within that there's SCI, which is sensitive compartmented information. And that is, I do think having a bunch of different clearances is not helpful. Having people not access information they don't need to have access to. Like, it even comes down to the breaches that we're seeing. Why are we still printing off documents for people? Like, there's just like, that can then be strewn around and like left places. So the more that you can simplify, even aspects of that, the better. So saying like, hey, we have this box of restricted information, only people who are working on this program who have this badge or credentialing are gonna get access to this, get read into this program and have access to this SAP or SCI.
Great. Thank you very much. I'm delighted now to welcome Arthur Herman. Arthur is a senior fellow here at Hudson. He is the author of 10 books.
10.
Pulitzer Prize finalist, author of the widely critically acclaimed New York Times bestseller, Freedom Forged, which explains how American business was critical to the arsenal of democracy in World War II. He is also someone who has written with great insight on this question of defense industrial security. A 2018 report produced by Hudson, Closing the Defense Industrial Security Gap with Japan. Arthur, I'd love to hear your thoughts on how Japan should, what Japan needs to do to improve its defense industrial security, why it is so critical, and how it fits into this broader framework of Japanese defense transformation.
Yeah, and with the changes that have come. And it's been interesting for me, and a privilege to be able to look back on this issue now almost 4 years after that report came out. And I was looking at it this morning, and I realized how much of it is still very relevant, actually. That report, let me tell you a little about how that report came about. It was a series of workshops that I ran here in Washington with both American and U.S. defense executives, government officials, but also security experts to talk about the differences between the way the U.S. Handles defense industrial security versus the practices that we wanted the Japanese themselves want to become involved in. And then I also ran similar workshops in Tokyo primarily with Japanese government officials, industry people, think tank participants as well. And then did a briefing for then Minister of Defense Onodera on our findings and what was taking place there. So I like to think that one of the changes that's been taking place has been that the issue of industrial security has really become much more a front and center policy issue in Japan. I'd like to think that that report and the briefings that I did on it helped to encourage that direction. But I also realized too, at the time that I was working on this, is that there were powerful cultural differences between the way in which the US made certain assumptions about what constitutes a safe and secure environment in which to conduct research, to work on weapon systems, to share sensitive data and information, which in the case of Japan, it was expecting too much to think that the Japanese would become just like us in thinking about these things, but that there were important ways in which the Japanese could arrive at equivalent systems with satisfactory results without necessarily having to mirror or mimic the way in which the US went about and took care of these things. That report was also interesting because that report was done before I served on the National Security Council.
Sure.
And before I had my own security clearance. And that was a learning experience as well, thinking about it not just in theoretical terms, but also the practical ways in which security clearance works, and the ways in which a secure environment operates. And what you come to realize is so much of it is about a frame of mind. It's about habits, don't you think? It's about how you go about just a daily process that is a way in which to protect what needs to be protected, but also remaining flexible about what doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to be a rigid system. And I'll give you an example. I think maybe the second or third day that I was on the council, I was meeting in one of the sensitive compartmental information facilities, a SCIF, with a DOD official, and all of a sudden my phone rang.
Oh.
And he had to point out, you were supposed to leave that.
Yeah.
You're supposed to leave that in the box outside. So I quickly got up, of course, and did that and all that. But it wasn't just a question of that. I then went and reported my breach, my security breach, to our security officer there. And anytime anything like that happened, where I would go into, forget to turn my phone off when I went into my own office, which was a SCIF, or having a classified document that as I was leaving for the day, wait a minute, why is this in my briefcase? It needs to go in the burn bag, or it needs to do that. And no matter how trivial or how quickly you correct it, you report it. It's a proactive, security is a proactive process. And that therefore, making sure employees and executives have that frame of mind and thinking is hugely important, even if they're former presidents and former vice presidents. That's the kind of habit of mind that goes with it. But that's on the smaller level. On the larger scale, I think of the issue of industrial security, and specifically defense industrial security. And I should point out that the work that I was doing was in the specific context of looking for ways to encourage cooperation between the US and Japan on these critical areas and in critical technologies, particularly defense-related technologies. It really falls into three categories. The first is cybersecurity, which is huge and hugely important, and one in which, if I may say, frankly, was the one in which, at the time, in 2018, in which there was the largest gap between the way in which Japan was operating with regard to cybersecurity regimes versus the United States. I mean, the United States, it's a paradox, isn't it? The United States is the country with the #1 cybersecurity breaches in the world, but we're also the one with the #1 cybersecurity defenses in the world. Sometimes those two things go together. People want to test, how really good are you? In the case of Japan, a lot of the breaches with regard to cybersecurity wasn't to find out how good Japan's defenses were. They knew that they were many times inadequate. So that's one reason I very much applaud the provision in the National Security Strategy now to incorporate an office which is specifically geared towards cybersecurity and cybersecurity operations. It's a big step and a very important one to have that formal framework in place. But that's a huge part of protecting what needs to be protected, whether it's in the defense arena, science and technology, or in the government, sensitive government information. The second one is physical security, which you touched on. And that is the facilities, whether you're talking about your office, a SCIF at the National Security Council, or whether you're talking about the plant floor for a defense contractor. And there, again, there's a hugely important part of getting employees, of getting executives and managers to be in the frame of mind about what to do and what not to do. Quite apart from having security cameras and having all the other sort of physical steps to make sure that people aren't leaving the premises with documents or with flash drives with sensitive information and so on. That's partly responsibility of security officials, but it's also responsibility of employees not to do stuff like that and to catch yourself when you do. Then there's the third aspect, and that's the personnel security clearances. And I must tell you that in my discussions with MOD officials in Japan, they all felt that this was the #1 issue that had to be overcome and dealt with if Japan was going to have a industrial security and security clearance regime that would be comparable with the United States. And it's a difficult challenge for Japan. Citizens in the former police state have a certain, I think, justifiable suspicion about how much they're willing to allow their government to pry into their private affairs or to gather data or information about their own private doings and about their lives. Very good reason to do so. So the question that has to be addressed is, how do you go about creating a regime for Japan that would allow for, let's say, universal security clearance system, as it's been suggested, or whether you follow a 3-tier or a 2-tier system, as we have in the United States. How do you do that in ways that will reassure the Japanese public, but also reassure applicants that the information that they give or that the government investigators are able to extract doesn't fall into the wrong hands, isn't used for malicious purposes. That's a challenge that has to be confronted. And here I think there is an opportunity for Japan, and this is one of the things I stressed in my report, for Japan in thinking about creating and building a strong industrial security regime for its defense industry, for government, and for its intelligence services, that there's a big opportunity for Japan that sits here, to think about it not as an imposition that the US or other allies have forced them to undergo, but as an opportunity. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, let's think about it in terms of one of 3 reforms that I see is really important. I think it's really important Japan now gets serious about this. #1, the first reform is they've got to really now step up and develop an equivalent of a defense security service. In other words, a cadre of professionals, security professionals, who oversee all the security clearances and also physical security in facilities that are linked to both Ministry of Defense, but also industry and other contractors who work with that, but who will also be in charge of overseeing a security clearance system. Second reform is, I think, there needs to be an interagency group working with the United States to provide security clearances for Japanese scientists, technicians, engineers, and others working with the United States. For example, with our national labs, the Department of Energy national labs, so that it's possible to to arrange for security clearances for Japanese visitors, which are the equivalent for what the US would expect at working in those same labs. And that can be a very good model, a good paradigm for how to develop a security clearance system for Japan as a whole. The Department of Energy security clearances are really, really good. The habits of mind about when you go to a national lab, like a Los Alamos or a Livermore, people check your ID. It's not just enough to have it around your neck saying that you have a security clearance to go here. They'll ask to see it, even though you've got it out, hanging outside your belt. Department of Energy might be a good place to look for a model for that kind of thing. But then the third one, and that is our security clearance system, and maybe Lindy will agree with me on this, is very effective, but it's also very antiquated. A lot of it depends on procedures, paperwork, investigations, and so on that have not kept up with 21st century technology. It's a time consuming. How long does it usually take now? What's the average time to get a security clearance?
It's around 100 days, depending on the clearance level.
Oh, that's fast.
That's fast.
I hear a lot of that. That
Yeah.
is, mine went through lickety-split, and that was an unusual one. It often takes a year or two
Yeah.
to get a security clearance. There are ways in which to mobilize modern technology, for example, artificial intelligence, big data analysis, in ways that can really speed up the process, but also make it more exact, to make it more accurate, ways that can take out the worry that some security officer somewhere who has a grudge against you will use the data about your private life against you in some ways, or that will have a bias against you because of where you come from or who you are. Turning a lot of these decisions over to a more automated process, using the tools here, this is a big opportunity. I'm thinking for companies like NTT, for example, to show the Americans and the Europeans and the others, here's how you build a modern security clearance system. These are the elements that go into it. That opportunity exists for Japan, I think, in this overall, as we look forward and ahead towards the reforms and the changes taking place here. And so I think with that in mind, it could well be the fact that if we met back here again 4 years from now, 4 years after, or 8 years after my report, that a discussion won't be, how do we bring the Japanese up to speed with what the American security clearance system is? It'll be, how can the US catch up with the Japanese with their advanced and streamlined security clearance and industrial security system? I'd like to see that happen.
Arthur, thank you. Very insightful. Let me ask you the benefits to Japan of having this system. You've written about this before, right, and so I'm familiar with your writings on it. Can you just point out a few of the benefits in terms of defense industrial cooperation, especially now that Japan is talking about the new hybrid fighter that it will be building with the UK and Italy?
That's a classic example. The ability to work together with US companies and European companies on an equal basis on advanced weapons systems. Because those companies and the governments behind them would have full faith and confidence that the engineers, the employees working there have the kind of security clearances that are necessary for sharing sensitive data and sensitive technology, as well as classified information. But also the facilities as well are policed and are organized in ways that maintain that very high level of security and protection of that sensitive data and information and technology. So you're talking about an enormous growth in the ability of Japanese companies and Japanese government to work side by side with the United States and its allies on advanced systems. Good example being hypersonics. I think in the hypersonics technology, I know this, Japan has done a lot of work, there's a lot to bring, but there are barriers that are going to be faced in terms of where security clearances stop and where the US has to assume the burden for taking on managing security and having personnel who are cleared when Japanese personnel are not, and working on aspects of those programs and projects. That's number one. Big increase in the way in which defense and defense-related cooperation take place. Number two, is science and technology cooperation. Set aside the issue about cooperation in defense-related issues. Think about it in terms of science and technology cooperation with, I mentioned the Department of Energy National Labs, on nuclear science, on a whole range of other projects, quantum projects, and I work a lot on that here. Japan has an enormous lot to offer, but there is another area where, again, by the way, it's going to have an impact on thinking about cybersecurity, because quantum is coming. So defense and protection against quantum threats have got to be foremost in Japan's mind, as they are now becoming foremost in the US mind. But quantum project and technology as a whole is things like quantum satellite technology, in which there's enormous opportunity for US and Japan to cooperate here. But there will be sensitive areas there with the technology where, again, having trust and faith that the scientists and technicians working on this have a sufficient security clearance to make that kind of thing possible and to make that work. And then there's a third one. And I know this is the one Ken and I have talked about a great deal, and that is an intelligence sharing and information as well. That to have a cadre of intelligence officials and technicians working in the technologies that support that work with full security clearances equivalent of, in which we can have full confidence, will be one of the breakthroughs that comes for bringing Japan more and more closer in to that elite club of intelligence sharing nations that includes Great Britain and Australia and Canada and New Zealand, namely the Five Eyes. And one of my goals has been, almost since arriving at Hudson, is to find ways that Japan can become formally the sixth eye. And industrial security, cybersecurity, security clearances are all important steps in bringing us to that final goal.
Thank you, Arthur. Mio, let me ask you, you've obviously seen immense transformation on the cyber side in Japan. You've worked for American corporations, you've worked at the MOD, you've worked for US corporations, obviously in a critical position at NTT. There are cultural challenges in Japan occasionally that one sees, for example, and this is this is not at a high level, but there are oftentimes divisions within Japanese companies that a problem will arise and they'll not even want to report it to their supervisors. How do you sort of, whether it, and this, on the manufacturing side this occurs, how do you kind of promote that kind of transformation, and how is that occurring on the cyber side now? How do you see things changing?
So I think that the culture of security overall, and also including the culture of cybersecurity, has been changing drastically in Japan over the last few years, especially after the world decided in Tokyo to host the Tokyo 2020 Summer Olympic and Paralympic Games, because this is a great opportunity for Japan to showcase not only the success of big sports events to the world, but also to showcase, well, unfortunately it's COVID, so we had to postpone it by 1 year, but still it's a great opportunity for Japan to showcase the technologies and innovation to the rest of the world. So Japan, it really triggered and urged the Japanese government and industries to enhance security in the physical domain and also cyber domain. And I think that it forged the Japanese companies to actually encourage employees to talk about cybersecurity and also the incidents more publicly, to share collected wisdoms to make sure that we can learn from each other. And also that I started to see that the culture changes within, even in the big Japanese companies. For example, so if you work for big Japanese companies, you do incident exercise on every quarter or at least twice a year. Mm-hmm. And at least 10 years ago, if you click fake phishing emails, then you're gonna be scolded by your manager, why you are clicking this attachment or link. But now people actually, if you as long as you report that the incident to your manager in a timely manner, then actually the manager will thank you, like, thank you so much for bringing it up to us to make sure that we can address the threats in a timely manner. So I think that this is a significant change. Of course, it's going to take time to make the change across the society in Japan, but still, like, we are doing efforts, and also to address what you brought up about cybersecurity challenges in Japan. So I'm not glorifying that Japan is perfect in terms of cybersecurity, but if you compare the number of ransomware incidents and also the number of payments to ransomware attackers between Japan and the United States, actually Japan is doing much better according to the statistics given by the proof point. So according to the statistics in 2021, because we haven't seen the 2022 statistics yet, but so the 50% of Japanese companies got hit by a ransomware attack in 2021. In the United States, it's almost like 65%. Well, the number is almost the same, 50%, 65%. However, when you look at how many companies are actually paying ransoms to criminals, it's only 20% in Japan, whereas it's almost 70% in the United States. And compared to other developed countries, the ratio is almost the same, and Japan is doing better. So I think that even though that Japan still needs to do more for overall security, including security clearance system, but I think Japan still have some ways to share our best practices to how to do better about ransomware attacks, for instance.
Excellent. No, yeah, look, our system is far from perfect at many levels. Arthur talked about his experience with his security clearance. I was one of the people in the, one of tens of millions of people in the Office of Personnel Management Files whose personal information was hacked by the Chinese, and it's, you know, and it's something that is quite disturbing, the amount of information they have about many of our individuals who hold security clearances. They have confidential health information, financial information, family information, and the like, so it's quite disturbing. Lindy, let me ask you about U.S. cooperation with other countries, to the extent you've seen the security clearance systems, the interoperability of these systems. Are there examples to follow, examples to avoid? How do you see all that?
I think usually our interactions with foreign countries, and this is where I'm not an expert either, is very specific to the individual. So you can give limited access authority to non-U.S. citizens to kind of access information within the U.S. system. Obviously, there are NATO security clearance processes. So for folks who are serving in those capacities for information sharing and things like that, it is still very much, again, an individual by individual, case by case process when it comes to that kind of collaboration. And that's why I do think any country, Japan included, could make a strong case for information sharing once you have that framework in place. I think the issue for the U.S. is like, what is the policy or what kind of a vetting process is happening? And you know, kind of as you mentioned, like what, for good or bad, I'm not necessarily sure that I would probably follow what all of the other countries are doing, but what the Five Eyes countries have established is that they have a framework for what they're doing. And I think we do love our policies here in the American federal government. And within the U.S., it's based out of, again, these executive orders that establish kind of the clearance procedures. And that's why it's very dependent on the current president in office to open and close doors too when it comes to interactions. And so you see, like, I think, you know, the interactions that are happening with Japan are obviously a positive step because it literally can flow. That is where it flows. It's out of the executive branch saying we want to establish further cooperation. The president has a lot of authority when it comes to granting access, eligibility, and classification, and that is all born out of executive order. And again, we can grant limited access authorities to specific information on a case-by-case basis to other individuals. So.
Let me ask you about another problem, which is this question of overclassification in the United States, which is one of the things that I remember with my clearance, I was given. There was an article that appeared in a major newspaper that I could not talk about because it was classified, though millions of people had read this article and this information was out in the public domain, but because I had a clearance, I couldn't talk about it. And it's one of these frustrating things about a security clearance sometimes, that there'll be information in the public domain that's either well known or known, And I was wondering if, as you know, they obviously this is a regular debate that goes on in the federal government, and it's something Ezra Cohn, one of our Hudson colleagues, has taken the lead in sort of trying to get the government to move away from overclassifying documents. I wonder if you'd say something about that. And
I could say so much on that. I mean, it is an issue, and the two things go hand in hand, and I think that's what is so important. I think being a leader on open source intelligence and being a leader on classified intelligence can both work together. And again, I think you made a great point that innovation is key, and we are trying to get there with Trusted Workforce 2.0, and I don't want to bash what the U.S. government is doing, because I think they are actually making progress now. But again, as starting out in this, you could do so much with technological enablement to establish a framework and a system where you're not creating kind of the dumb overclassification aspect of it, where we have the issue now where a ton of classified information comes into the system, it gets classified because somebody with a security clearance is viewing it, and then it will take 5 years for that classification marker to go away. So there's two sides of it. The personnel vetting piece of it is key. I think the document classification, you can just avoid that, I think would be just a great idea, because we don't need to reclassify or overclassify information that's clearly not classified, that has been pulled in by open source. But the way we tend to do it now is kind of we're pulling in all of this information, and because we don't have an OSINT branch arm real focus in the US the way I think we should. I think if we did that, then maybe we would create a better dynamic where we're protecting the crown jewels, which are key. And I think that you always protect your most sensitive information, and then please do not waste time, resource, assets protecting things that don't need to be protected.
Mihoko.
Oh, thank you. But I'd like to ask a question to the rest of the panels. So I sort of that the ongoing war in Ukraine is giving us a great opportunity to how to quickly declassify the intelligence to share amongst trusted partners, because the U.S. government and also the British government are trying to proactively share intelligence during the ongoing war in Ukraine. So I think that maybe we can draw lessons from here. That, okay, well, we have tendencies to do overclassification. Maybe it's so hard to get away with that tendency, but still we can declassify and sanitize the intelligence in a timely manner so that we can still suddenly challenge the current programs.
Yeah, no, that's a great example of a success story from the IC in doing that. Oh. Yes.
And in particular, because so much of the intelligence is based on commercial satellite photography, stuff that's already in the public domain. And we've seen with this digital first war that Ukraine is fighting in, Ukraine deserves immense credit for its incredible use of artificial intelligence to target Russian soldiers, Russian facilities, and Russia does not have the similar kind of capabilities that we do in the West to benefit from our artificial intelligence. It's made a huge difference in the war once Ukraine started using these tools, and it's been a remarkable change. And so it all fits in that warfare is not in this all-domain warfare. Warfare is not the exclusive domain of governments anymore, for what it's worth. And so it involves the private sector, as you mentioned. It involves these satellites. It involves our, software companies and others aiding in these efforts. So it really makes industrial security all the more important, and it arguably makes the government clearance process the need to sort of declassify and to have. To understand not everything can be classified. There is really this cultural tendency within the U.S. government to want to, grab onto something and classify, which makes
especially the intelligence community is where that lies in. And what you could really develop, and again with the help of technology, is a kind of just-in-time classification system. In other words, it's classified just in that period of time when this is actionable intelligence or actionable data information, which should be in the control of decision makers, as few as possible, so that you can so you can control what happens, and that other eyes, prying eyes, can't see it. But then, when it's done, it's done. You move on, rather than simply having archiving more and more classified documents. The United States does not have what the British have, and that's an Official Secrets Act. And in many ways, that solves their problem because just about anything that they say is official secret is then covered and nothing can be leaked out. We can't do that, I think, for a number of reasons. One is because we're a rather more open society, in fact, than the Brits are, thanks to the Constitution and Bill of Rights. But I think it's also because an Official Secrets Act in that regard could work in Japan's case. It could possibly work as a way in which to sort of just create a sort of blanket system by which whatever the government says is classified, that's it, and you can't leak it, you go to jail if you do. That's another one of the aspects, too, I think, that's also difficult to face when it comes to issues about an industrial security regime, is there have to be punitive measures as well. If you breach it, if you transgress the system, even sometimes without malicious intent, there are consequences. And I think that's also one of the things that Japan is now, with the economic security legislation, began to build in that aspect of it. It's one thing to encourage people to act responsibly with classified data and information, but you also have to be there. If you don't, there's going to be penalties that have it, whether it's to your career, whether it's in terms of fines, or even something much worse than that.
Yeah, Lindy, let me ask you a question. In terms of when you see younger people getting into the security clearance, getting their security clearances and learning to handle data and all this, are younger people more likely to be negligent in your opinion? Do you know any data, or is it people longer in the system that get sloppy, or what?
When you look at the significant breaches, you have spanned the spectrum from reality winner to Harold Martin. From I'm sticking a few documents in my pantyhose till I have like terabytes of data in my car and garage and house. So what I find is that there is no one common denominator, which obviously makes the paradigm super difficult when you're trying to vet this process. There's a few different things. I think a lot of behavioral analysis. Again, you could totally geek out on that. There are some like interesting insights and things going out there. But that's why it comes down to trust.
Yeah.
A big reason that people get their clearances denied in the U.S. is failure to pay their taxes, which I'm like, I mean, no brainer. Like you're not allegiant to the government enough to pay your taxes. You're not going to get a security clearance. But people still apply. Like that's what is shocking is people still will apply for these positions or have a clearance for a number of years and then not pay. So I think the basics of rule, if you don't like to follow rules, and Japan, I mean, culturally it does make a difference here. But in the U.S., it's like the people who don't want to follow the rules are people that are probably going to misuse information. I don't think that there's really generational barriers. And I think it's been good for the U.S. as they're implementing this continuous vetting program because there were thoughts that, young people are not going to want to be vetted by the government. Those kids are all on TikTok. They don't care who's who's watching what they do online. They're an open book, which I think helps the government paradigm. Hey, we want some information about you. It's not actually any more.
By the way, this is another area where the predictive power of AI and machine learning applications works. Because we have to remember security clearance isn't just a one-time thing, it's an ongoing process. And a continuous review looking for behavioral changes in ways that coworkers or superiors or even kind of the formal application and review process may miss, that a more systematic and more predictive model provided for you by technology might be able to pick up in ways that say, this is someone who maybe shouldn't lose security clearance, but might be at risk.
Well, and you mentioned the self-reporting aspect of the key, which is policy. You do have a policy once you obtain a security clearance that you have to narc on yourself if you violate any classification procedures. In the past 2 years, they actually updated that policy, so now you actually also have to narc on any other person who has a security clearance that you know about. And I don't know how effective this is because the typical thing, they created the policy and then everybody's like, how do I do it? Who do I email? Do I tell my boss? Do I tell my? So I think if they had a better framework, I think that would be key because it's saying, again, it's about this elite classified club, right? This is a credential that you have and that you want to keep. And then also there's accountability for yourself and also amongst your coworkers because your coworkers are probably more likely to see the fact that, he started showing up for late work every day, smell
something on your
alcohol
breath.
on your
That's
breath.
right. Sure.
I don't know what you've been doing at your lunch hour. And then, hey, the process being now, again, because you're a trusted worker, we actually want to help you get help. Like, do you need help? Do you need, financial counseling? Do you need to go to an alcohol treatment facility? The government is trying to be more proactive. Do you need mental health treatment? Please go get it. You will not lose your security clearance for those things. And that's why the educational piece of it is so key.
Yeah. By the way, I want to make one quick addendum. When I mentioned the Official Secrets Act and said Japan, I was not recommending that Japan take on an Official Secrets Act. Actually, I think Japan would be the perfect place where that would be the worst place, in fact, to adopt. But it would seem to be a quick solution to the whole question about security clearance, and that is, if you work for the government, you sign the Official Secrets Act, and you can't do anything with the information that you get out. You don't need that. The United States doesn't have it, and our security clearance system, I think, works really well. Most of everyone that I worked with at National Security Council, anyone I dealt with at DOD, from that point of view, from a security clearance, people are aware and are on top of this situation. It works extremely well. Don't need a authoritarian top-down system. You need a system that encourages trust among employees, among executives and others, a trust and verify system. That's what's the key, and I think that's where Japan can learn from the U.S. model.
Let me ask you, and we'll try to wrap things up.
Sure.
In terms of the specific government agencies that you've worked with in Japan, do you think, would there be an ideal agency overall that would overall handle security clearances? Do you think it should be shifted within various bureaucracies? What's your sense, given your experience, your extraordinary experience with cyber in Japan and the amazing cultural transformation there?
So Japan already has a security clearance system, but mostly for the traditional defense community people. So what Japan needs to do next is how to expand the security clearance systems to non-traditional defense community and also to include the industries. So I think that it makes sense for the Japanese government to outsource that kind of capabilities to personnel agency, because they are responsible to hire people and to do the background checking, but they need to build upon new background check capabilities for top secret and secret people, and also because the United States has already so much vast experiences and best practices to do security clearance system and vetting. So I think Japan can really learn from the US experiences and also to use Japanese quantum computing or quantum cryptography technologies to accelerate that kind of processes.
I would love to see that. That would be really great.
Great. Well, I want to thank all three of you. This has really been an extraordinary panel, and we all now, I think, have a very clear sense of the critical importance of cybersecurity, information security, industrial security to Japan's defense transformation. Look forward to reconvening in a few years to see how much progress has been made, but I really want to thank our panelists. Thank you so much.
Thank you.